So, have you ever had this happen where you're working on a really challenging project, something that just takes your blood, sweat, and tears, and you crush it? You actually get some really good insights, and you're looking forward to sharing your performance and findings with the team. But it doesn't go the way you hoped. The project stakeholders don't agree to take the action that you showed them that they need to take. So I was in charge of managing their online marketing channels, and the client was heavily invested in banner ads and premium content like golf sites. And Google Ads, or back then it was AdWords, was still relatively new. So I wanted to add it to their marketing mix. So we did that and got a really good cost per reservation. It outperformed all their other channels. But my client was still on the fence about it. So I did what any good marketer would do. I worked really hard and optimized and cut that CPA in half. So we were getting a $66 cost per reservation with banners. We were down to $5 for Google Ads. Now, that's pretty impressive, right? Well, I couldn't get my clients to think so. They were actually pretty unconvinced and critical. They were saying things like, well, are we sure we're reaching the right user profile with this? Or, that cost per impression is actually really high. Or how do we know that they'll be brand loyal? Or let's revisit this next quarter. And of course, that never happened. Now, I thought they were bad clients because clients are supposed to care about results, and I was driving great results. It felt unfair to have my work and ideas blocked by critics, because when critics don't say yes and they don't buy into your recommendations, it creates a vicious cycle where we can't get traction and approval. So that limits the results that we can drive. Without buy-in, none of this works. Now, this wasn't just a one-off experience where someone said no. This happened a lot. And I'd find myself asking, why am I working so hard to drive amazing results for people who don't even know enough about their own business to appreciate how big of a win this is? Now, the truth is, I was spending pretty much all my time working on the results and very little time helping people understand the results. And this went on for years, where basically I just resented people for not recognizing how good of a job I was doing. Now, the really sad thing is that even as I learned that you're supposed to help your audience understand their reports, I still was not good at doing that. Maybe it was the curse of knowledge, but I just thought it was all self-evident. So years ago, I was preparing a performance deck, and the client was like, like they didn't really get it. And my manager made me redo the report. And I had no tricks left up my sleeve. So I took this kind of explain to me like I'm five approach, where instead of just saying, it was 120% lift, I added a thumbs up and said 120% lift is actually very good. And I just assumed no pre-existing knowledge of the situation. I simplified my charts and visualizations. I honestly felt ridiculous sending off this just watered down version of the deck I was used to sending. And I was seriously surprised that it worked. The clients came back and said it was exactly what they were looking for to send to their leadership team. And I was amazed because it was one of the first times that I had experienced a change in disposition where someone who had been negative about my work suddenly appreciated it. And I knew that if it happened once, I could probably get it to happen again. So I made it my mission to crack the code on how to create reports that would win over my audience, because if there was a way out of this cycle of misery, I wanted it. So as I did this, as I improved my reports, I realized that I had actually been creating a lot of the contention and frustration that I thought I was the victim of. Changing my reporting process transformed my relationship with stakeholders. Today, it's so much easier to get agreement and approval. It's an easy check-in. It's not a debate. This means that not only do I have permission to implement my recommendations, but the client is committed to doing their part to invest in content or optimize for mobile or finally fix their feed. That, of course, drives better results. And bigger wins for your stakeholders also means more success for you. It takes you from ignored analyst to rainmaker in your industry, where your contributions are driving appreciation and compensation. So how do we get here? Well, I'm going to give you a formula, which this persuasion formula. It's the problem, agitate, solve model. And Dan Kennedy, who's a copywriting legend, calls this the most reliable sales formula ever invented. So of course we want to use it with our reports. Now we're also going to borrow some of the best ideas in data visualization and storytelling and communications, and we're going to use this formula as a framework to do that. So we start with a problem. And a lot of times we avoid including problems in our reports because we want our clients to feel taken care of, right? That they don't have any problems. Plus, it's hard enough to get them to be excited about a win. We don't want to focus on the problems and on the negative. But if you tell your client that the weather is great and the water's fine and it's a beautiful day at the beach, then that is what they'll picture. So when you then tell them that they need to invest like $20,000 in beach safety measures, they're not going to see it as a priority. Why would they? Now, what they don't know, we do, is that these are shark-infested waters. But we cropped that out of the report because it wasn't favorable. Now, it's not the client's fault that they don't prioritize a problem that they weren't aware of. What this means for us is we need to stop sending sanitized, cherry-picked reports that make us look good. I do a lot of auditing for companies on their digital marketing. And when I ask the marketing manager, like, well, how's it going for you? Most of the time they'll say something to the effect of, I honestly don't know. Like our reports that we get from our vendor always seem like they're telling a good story, but it's like they just pick whatever metric is doing the best that month and focus on that. Like they don't know the big picture. Now, not only does this erode client trust, but it also creates a new problem, which is that you won't get buy-in to solve a problem that the client doesn't believe they have. And the problem is not your metrics. And the problem is not a description of your metrics. The problem is what lies beneath the metrics. It's the actual iceberg, not just that self-evident tip of the iceberg. So we need to look at what's causing the problem. Where did the iceberg come from? And this could be internal forces, like your KPIs changed, or they're being measured differently, or you've changed your offer. It could be external forces, like increased competition, or government restrictions, or shifting demographics. You also want to look at the relationships, right? What's changed and what's the trend? So in the case of our steakhouse, it wasn't an external factor. It was what was happening internally with budget distribution versus what could be happening if we were smarter about that. So to put this in a sentence for our stakeholders, there was a missed opportunity to drive significantly more reservations to the same marketing budget. Now, that's our conclusion. We have to show our clients and audience that it's true. So we need to expose the problem. Now, the reports that I was sending did a really bad job of exposing the problem. I didn't really know any better. I was just following the model I had seen where you just put a bunch of metrics on a table. What I've learned is we read left to right, right? So we assume that whatever's on the left is most important. And it took me a while to realize this. I'd wonder, like, why are my clients so focused on impression data? Impressions are not the story. Well, I was making it the story because I was putting it first. So once I learned that and switched things up a bit, no one ever comments. We don't have conversations about impression volume anymore. So we can improve the chart here, improve the page, by leading with a problem statement that AdWords drives significantly more reservations for its marketing budget. Lead with reservations, which wasn't even a column on the other table because it was so crowded it didn't fit. And just start to make it a little bit easier to read, right? It's already a little bit improved, but there's still ways to go. So in addition to exposing the problem, you want to visualize the problem. Now, this is important. Dashboards are the wrong tool to share most problems with stakeholders. Now, as a subject matter expert, you need the dashboard view to analyze a lot of metrics all at once and see what's going on. But if you're not a subject matter expert, then this view is not helpful. It's overwhelming. Imagine that you're on this flight and you ask the pilot what time you'll be landing. And instead of telling you the time, he says, oh yeah, you can find that out by looking at my dashboards. I've got all the data you need right here, and it's updated in real time. Like, that's not helpful. If you're the passenger or if you're a client, you need the information presented differently. You want that, right? So we need to find a way to curate what we're sharing to help our audience and stakeholders get the information that they need to do their job in a way that's curated for them and not us. So how do we design charts for our stakeholders to reduce their cognitive load and make sure that they can understand them? Well, we can start with the inverted pyramid of journalism, where we lead with what's most important, followed by main ideas, and then finally get to supporting details. And this helps to establish hierarchy. So rather than just getting everything all at once, we're focusing on big to small. Then using one idea per slide rather than the most number of charts you can possibly fit on a page. Title and label each chart so it's clear what it's about. And then use descriptions and microcopy where needed for things like acronyms, definitions, annotations, instructions, and context. Now, there's a lot right there, so let's go through some examples. Now, when we think of presenting a lot of metrics at once, we think of tables. There's a great way to show all sorts of data at the same time, but there's no hierarchy to this. And the stakeholder looking at this is going to have no idea how to interpret it or what actually to take. So I don't know that the stakeholder needs to see a wall of metrics or even all these metrics all at once, but if they do, we can give this chart a makeover and make it a little bit easier to read. So here we have all the exact same data. It includes all those metrics, but we've established a hierarchy. We've created, put KPIs like revenue and ROI front and center, and we've de-emphasized less important metrics like impressions and click-through rate. So our stakeholder is going to have a lot easier time understanding the hierarchy and knowing where to put their attention on a slide like this. Now, titles and context make your charts easier to interpret. This is pretty obvious, right? The chart that's on the right tells a story that the chart on the left doesn't tell you anything. And I'll say that the problem we have is that we don't know that titles help. It's that most automated reporting software doesn't natively do this. So we have to go in and manually add the titles or any sort of context that we want to include for our stakeholders. And as digital marketers, we tend to be a little bit allergic to this idea of doing work because we're like, oh, it should all be set it and forget it. It should be done for me. But if you invest the time to make your charts easier to read so that your audience takes less time to understand what they're about, you will see a return on that investment of time that you put into it. Now, this is a revenue e-commerce template from the Google Data Studio templates file. Now, it's pretty easy to just grab something like this and just share it with stakeholders. But if you're a stakeholder, what would you possibly do with this? Like, how are you doing month over month? How are you going to interpret that? Are you hitting your goals or not? Like, what's next? It's really hard to know what to do. So we can make some changes. So where we see we're leading with sessions and followed by revenue, we can switch that around so we're leading with what's most important for business growth. Also, obviously, add a title so it's a little more clear what it's about. We can add scorecards for our primary KPIs, so you can tell at a glance how we're doing and not just try to infer it from a time series chart. And then we could add a tracker like a bullet chart where we can compare the actual against the target. Now, all of this is going to provide a lot more context and make it much easier for our stakeholder to know what to do about it. Now, the best way to share an important idea with your stakeholders is to put it on its own slide. This gives the chart space to breathe, and it focuses your audience's attention. One idea per slide can drive conversations that cluttered dashboards just can't. Now, visualizing the problem is especially important when we're dealing with external factors. So here we have traffic is down due to the pandemic, but the chart visualization is of the symptom, not the problem. So what we can do here is we can benchmark this against the Google Trends Index. So here we can actually show that prior to the pandemic, we were underperforming the index, and now we're outperforming that baseline or benchmark after the pandemic. That's really important context to have. So back to the steakhouse. There's still too much to interpret on this chart, right? Even though it's a bit of an improvement. So we could add heat maps and bar charts to show the relationship across different channels and different metrics. But ultimately, there are several columns here that aren't telling the story that AdWords drives more reservations for its marketing budget. Now, they're not bad metrics, but in the context of what we're trying to accomplish, they become noise instead of signal. So we can remove those extra columns and just focus here on reservations and spend. Right now, we're starting to tell the story and substantiate this big idea that we have more reservations for our marketing budget with AdWords, where we have very little budget, but a whole lot of reservations for it. Now, the next step in the problem agitate solve model is to agitate. You might be wondering why this is even a step, right? We've solved the problem. Why can't we just jump into solving it? Well, the reason for that is lizard brain. We need our audience to be engaged, not just informed. And we need to make the problem feel real. Here we have revenue and spend across a lot of campaigns over time. And based on the size and shape of the charts, it looks like the amounts are about the same. Like, you have to really be paying attention to see that this bar right here is for $62,000, and this one over here is for $9,000. Now, these are not inaccurate data visualizations, but they can lead us to the wrong conclusions about the magnitude of data that we're seeing. Our brains have a really hard time processing big numbers at scale. Chip Heath came out with a great new book called Making Numbers Count, and he explains this concept of psychophysical numbing, which is that the higher numbers get, the less sensitive we get to them. Now, he says that the threshold where our brains go from like this concrete numbers that we can understand to an abstract concept of lots is 5. We don't process big numbers very well. So knowing that, we can already see that this chart still has some problems because we're asking people to process a whole lot of big numbers across 2 different axes. So we can normalize this by asking the question, well, how much does our marketing budget get us? And then taking that answer and scaling it way down. So for every $100 we spend on AdWords, we drive about 20 reservations, right? And that's double all the other channels combined. We have one axis here, just one set of numbers, and you don't have to work too hard to understand it. Now, even though we have to do better with small numbers, we need to make sure we don't lose the impact of the problem. So in 2021, slower page load speeds contributed to conversion rates declining from 2.56% to 2.7%. That's a fraction of a percent. It doesn't feel like anything. But we could show the gravity and the impact of the problem by saying, it's a $3 million loss in revenue. We could take that further and put it in the context of operations by saying, that's enough to open 6 new locations. Now, we also want to make it emotional. And this is another area where, as data-driven digital marketers and analysts, we run into trouble. Because we're always thinking, well, my boss, my manager, my client, they only care about the data. They don't need emotion. I used to believe that. But what I found is that stakeholders don't actually respond to the numbers. They respond to how they feel about the numbers. Logic drives action is a lie. People who have frontal lobe damage, who don't experience emotion, have a much harder time making decisions. High-level cognition requires emotion, which then drives action. So if our stakeholders aren't motivated by the data, what are we supposed to do about that? Well, we need to ask the question how we want them to feel. And we're going to push past that we want them to feel happy about our work, right? We need to focus on the issue and how they need to feel about the issue in order to take action. And then we need to ask what needs to happen for them to feel that way. Make sure we can choose charts and be selective about colors to inspire a specific response. But ultimately, we need to understand where our stakeholders are coming from and what biases and beliefs are they bringing with them before they even look at our reports. That's going to shape how we need to present our information. Now, if any of you work with Google Ads reps, you know that they are incentivized to get you to adopt whatever initiative of the quarter that they need you to push, right? So even if it's the wrong move for your account, they're going to tell you to do it anyway. This can create a conflict of interest where a lot of times we just end up saying, hey, you know what, we're not even going to do what you tell us to do because we don't even trust it. In 2014, I had a Google Ads rep who used a completely different playbook though. One of the first things he ever said to me was, how can I help you get your next promotion? Now, no Google Ads rep has ever said this to me before or since, but it really created a very different working relationship with him where I felt like my shoulders relaxed when he asked that. And we were able to collaborate and work together to figure out what was in the best interest of our clients. Like, how can we move forward on that? And we were able to invest even more with the platform because we were getting better results because of the ideas he brought to the table. Because he started with how he could help me rather than the other way around of just pushing what his narrative was supposed to be. So when it comes to our stakeholders, we need to understand their emotional currency and their emotional KPIs, right? We need to push past just the business KPIs. Hopefully we know those, but get further into it and know what's actually motivating them. Like, what are their fears and drivers? Now, this is not necessarily an easy thing to do. We talked earlier about how to put together a client persona or an ideal client avatar. And when we're looking at scale, we have tools for that. We can get disposition analysis, and we can use surveys and get voice of customer data and kind of aggregate a lot of big data to tell us something about our audience. But when we're just dealing with one person, we don't have tools for that. And it can be really awkward to say like, hey, we've been working together for a really long time now, but what do you care about? Like, it doesn't feel very natural. So I'm going to give you my go-to question that you can ask any client at any stage of the project. And that's, how can I make your job easier? Now, I have not ever had anyone answer this negatively or say like, well, you're supposed to have asked me that earlier. I'm not going to tell you now. Like, people are pretty open when you ask something like that. You can also say, is there anything you want to see in the report that you're not seeing? Is there anything that's confusing? What questions do you need to answer to leadership that you're having a hard time with? Now, how and where you ask these questions will affect the answers that you get. Because if you ask in the board meeting, like, do you understand that acronym? Everyone will say yes. No one wants to look stupid. No one wants to be put on the spot and say they don't know something. But if you ask it in a one-on-one, right, when you're having a direct conversation, like, hey, what can I do to help? What can we do to make this easier for you? You'll probably get some good answers. And I think sometimes we have the other fear, I guess, about asking questions like this is, what if they come to me and have all these ideas and it's out of scope? You're not obligated to do anything that they say. You don't turn into a genie that has to do all sorts of stuff, but it does give you that position of strength. You can solve their problems on a deeper level. And whether that's saying, hey, here's a resource that might work for you, or we can do that and it's going to change the scope and here's what that's going to look like. It still gives you that insight that you wouldn't have had if you didn't ask the questions. So another way to bring emotion into our reports is curating how we present the data. So this chart is too busy. It doesn't tell you anything, right? It just says category performance is changing over time. Like that's not helpful. Now, this next version says category X has declined 40% year over year, and it shows you specifically where to focus your attention. It tells you how to feel about it. Here we have category X is becoming more efficient over time. So that same downward trend, we now understand that to be positive rather than a negative because of how it's presented. So the same data set, we're going to feel different ways based on factors that help us better understand the data, right? These are pre-attentive attributes, which is variations in line, color, shape, and intensity that grab and focus the attention of your audience. Now, you just want to make sure that you're going for contrast and not chaos, especially with color, because color blindness can make everything look muddy. So we can take that concept of introducing color and put it here for 20 reservations. So we know that that's a good thing. We know to interpret it as positive. And so we see that in the text and in the bar chart. We could also reframe this as, for every one reservation we drive, we lose 2 to our direct competitors because of poor budget distribution. Now, we move towards pleasure and away from pain. And we move faster away from pain. So the idea of losing to our competitors is painful, and it's a powerful way to communicate the urgency of a problem. Now, does this mean that we should make our reports look bad on purpose? Sometimes. Like if we were to look at this slide together, you're not going to feel any particular way. There's no way to. It doesn't have any emotion attached to it. But if we say landing page traffic is down 63% month over month because of XYZ, that's a 2/3 decrease month over month. Now you feel something, right? That's alarming. And you want to know what XYZ is so that you can solve it. Well, that's exactly where we want to be. Once we've identified the problem, we've agitated it, now it's time to solve it. Now, one of my favorite sayings is a clearly defined problem is already partially solved. Like when you know what you're dealing with, it's easier for you to come up with a solution. And it's easier for your clients and stakeholders to know what the solution is too. Paul Smith is an organizational storyteller, and he talks about a time that he had this really challenging problem to solve, which was to understand why after the year 1983 for this company, there was no correlation at all between marketing and profits. So he worked super hard to figure out what was going on, why that was the case. And then instead of just bringing the answer up to his team, he actually had them start to guess, to brainstorm on why this might be. And so as people kind of gave their different ideas, he'd say, okay, I thought that too, but here's what I found, or that's not quite it, but it's valid, but here's where we are. Well, once someone finally got the answer, the actual reason for this lack of correlation, there's this collective moment in the room, and people immediately started trying to figure out how to solve the problem. They were thinking about what recommendations, what next steps and actions could they take to solve for that. He said that his recommendations became their recommendations, and what he had later in the deck, they were already arrived at, they were totally bought into, and they adopted those ideas immediately. And that's what we're trying to orchestrate. We want to make action obvious and easy. We're giving our stakeholders a call to action, and whether it's implicit or explicit, it needs to be clear. Now, there's nothing obvious or easy about how I was approaching reporting. I should have done it very differently. I could have said, well, the good news is that for every $100 we spend on AdWords, we drive about 20 reservations, right? You can easily understand and interpret this chart. The bad news is we're missing out on thousands of reservations each month due to unoptimized budget distribution. Now here, we've identified the problem and agitated it, right? Look at how much we're losing out on by not using these optimized or fully funded options. Now, when we present the data like that, our clients are going to have different questions. They're going to say, well, what does fully funded look like? How many incremental reservations can we get? What's the ideal market mix? What other opportunities are we missing? And you'll know you're doing it right when the questions you get aren't questioning you, not questioning your sources, but they're questioning, well, what do we do about it? So you can come with some projections and some ideas, right? This is what an optimized budget might look like. This is what fully funded could look like. And sometimes there's going to be one really clear course of action to take, but most of the time it's still a discussion because you need to figure out constraints and priorities to figure out what's going to be the most appropriate way to move forward. Now, if you've done your job identifying the problem and agitating it, it's easy for your client to be excited about taking action. But you know what else is easy? It's not taking action. Status quo is easier than change. It's easier to make New Year's resolutions than it is to keep them. So we need buy-in, but that's not the finish line because everything that needs to happen still needs to happen. So you want to keep the momentum going and keep your audience committed past the level of agreement. So you're going to identify next steps, specify who's responsible, clarify the task, set deadlines, use active voice, and follow up on project management. And I think project management is key here because if you don't know where you're going at the beginning of the conversation, then it requires a lot more active participation than just saying, this thing needs to happen. Like, you need to get out of that passive role and start actually making assignments. And people are going to respond a lot better, and they're a lot more likely to take action when you're not just giving them homework, but you're actively working with them to help them accomplish their own priorities and goals. Your stakeholders should be deeply invested in the success of this project because ultimately, even if you leave, the problem's still there. So it should be even more important to them than to you to solve it. So we need to make our stakeholders the heroes of the story. Now, you may have noticed a pattern here that the problem, agitate, solve model is pretty much identical to a 3-act story structure. We expose the problem, we agitate it by introducing conflict, and we solve it. Now, you've probably heard a lot that we need to tell stories with our data. And I think that can fall a little flat because we're dealing with reports here. It's not a Pixar movie. We're not going to have all sorts of character development and plot lines. And we can clarify the story with narrative and context and color. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is tell the story of our client's own hero's journey. That means that in the hero's journey, they are Luke Skywalker. We're their Yoda, right? We're the expert that guides them along the journey. That means that the journey and the victory is theirs. It's not ours. And this is another thing that can seem counterintuitive, because if it looks like they're doing everything and we're doing nothing, right, then why are they going to keep us employed? Like, a lot of times we want to claim the victory so that they know that they need to keep on writing those checks. But the truth is that if they need us in order to look good, to be successful at their job, they have every reason to keep us around. And especially as we're helping to promote them, we're helping to support them, when we're making them look good, they're not going to let that go. You never want to miss an opportunity to praise your client or your stakeholder for being involved in the solution. This amazing performance is brought to you by, and we showcase that it's their win too. Now, true story, these are real numbers. We are getting an $88 return on ad spend, which is an excellent ROAS. But the owner of the company wanted to shut off paid search. Like, maybe he saw that graph we saw this morning that suggested that paid search doesn't work. But he didn't just want to fire us, right? He wanted to shut off paid search of the channel. And our direct contact was the VP of marketing. He understands the value that we bring to the table. So we collaborated and worked together to build out POVs that showed why it's in their best interest to continue investing in paid search. And part of that is revenue and results. And part of it is just everywhere that we can show up with ads that blue links can't, right? That they're not invited to the party. From the top of YouTube or Discovery or in Gmail or pretty much anywhere that we're limited with the organic reach that we can really go further. So we were able to tell that story and we kept the account. And I would have thought that it would be our results alone that could save us. But we kept the account because we had the buy-in of an ally. Now, when I think about the reports that I used to send, it's cringy and it's a little ironic because I wasn't treating my audience and stakeholders with the same respect that I insisted that we treat their site visitors. Right? We build out landing pages very intentionally to reduce friction and get people to say yes to the offer. But with my reports, you had to work really hard to figure out what they were about and why they mattered, even though in my head it was just obvious. It was like I was somewhere that I didn't speak the language, so it was just talking louder. But the good news is that you don't need to learn a new language to improve your reports. It's just about saying things differently. So the problem, agitate, solve model is a great way to share insights with stakeholders where you're not talking louder, but you're speaking their language. It starts with you identifying the problem and then taking the bold action of visualizing the problem for your audience. Then you go out of your way and make sure that they feel what's at stake, and also that you understand what's at stake for them beyond the metrics. Finally, you work together to solve the problem, to identify what the next steps are, and to support them in their own journey. When this is happening, buy-in becomes inevitable. Instead of that vicious cycle where we're defending our work to critics, this process creates a virtuous cycle where our stakeholders care about our insights and reports and matters to them. And we are able to drive meaningful change and actually get emotional buy-in, leading to bigger wins, more impact, better relationships, and ultimately more growth. We do have, I think, some time for questions if anyone has any questions. There's one up here.
All right. I work for an airport, actually, so we don't have direct access to revenue, as my goal in marketing is to fill seats. But I don't work for the airline, so we don't actually get to see who actually books a ticket and how much revenue they made. So what would you say, like, we're always looking at how do we measure the effectiveness of our campaigns when we can't actually see who's purchasing a ticket. So do you have like a suggestion on like what we can do to help measure something?
Okay, so just to make sure I understand the question, the issue is that you work for the airline and you drive revenue, but you're not able to measure the revenue that you're driving. Is that right?
I work for the airport.
You work for the airport.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're driving revenue, is that right? But you can't measure it?
Yeah. So we support like our nonstop destinations and our airlines, and we do like campaigns trying to get people to maybe go to that specific destination, but we can't actually see who's booked a ticket.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a little bit of lack of transparency with what you're trying to do and actually the outcome of that, right? And it's hard to measure. I mean, what we do in those situations is coming up with like, unfortunately, it's what's the next best thing, right? What is that key performance indicator you can use? And then it's deciding on that and sticking to it. Because when you can't do that, and this happens all the time, even when there is revenue, right? Like we're trying to ultimately drive signups, and then we're optimizing for MQLs, right? Marketing qualified leads, because that's what our department is assigned to. But then it's like, oh, but they're actually not converting down funnel. We need to optimize for sales qualified leads. But then marketing qualified leads go down as we improve the quality of the lead. And then it's like, well, it always flip-flops. I mean, it's always flip-flopping. You can't really do anything with that because it's just like, we're just picking another thing to focus on. So if you can get a KPI, whatever that's going to be, whether that's going to be engagement, like click-throughs, time on site, like I'm not familiar with what that's going to look like. But once you determine that model, then you're going to kind of say like, how do we ensure that this is driving business growth, right? It should be connected to that. But then you want to just be consistent about reporting on that and not just hopping around, because it sounds like that's kind of the situation you're dealing with, is always getting your mind changed about it. And so you need to be responsible for getting one particular outcome that you can optimize for. So I don't know what that is, but it just needs to be consistent.
Yeah, thank you. That's what we're working on.
Cool. All right, cool. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.